All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Nautical Institute Hong Kong branch webinar today on the topic, the ever-changing job of casualty investigation as seen from a mariner solicitor's perspective. My name is Hans Langsrud, and I'm the chairman of the Nautical Institute here in Hong Kong. And we are more than grateful for the response we have received from participants globally. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today. The Hong Kong branch aims this year to be as active as we can with in-person events as we have used to do in the past, but COVID restrictions this time prevented us to do an in-person event. So we decided to go for a webinar. We certainly hope that at least our main event this year, the celebration of the Nautical Institute 50th anniversary in November, will be in person. Let's see. Before we start, I would like to go through a few housekeeping rules. Please note that we are recording the webinar, and we will make the recording available as soon as possible after the session. Please keep your microphone muted and the video off during the presentation. Feel free to drop questions on the topic using the chat button on the bottom center of the screen. Then we will do our best to moderate the questions, which will be answered after the presentation. Now, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Richard Oakley of Ince, who kindly agreed on short notice to do this presentation. Richard Oakley is a master mariner and solicitor of England, Wales, and Hong Kong. And Richard is a hugely experienced casualty investigator. He first went to sea in 1988, and he worked on a wide variety of vessels and obtained his Master Mariner's qualification. Richard then came ashore in 1997 to study to become a shipping solicitor. Prior to embarking on his legal career, Richard spent 5 years at a leading international P&I club. Richard joined Ince in 2008, and he is now a partner with them in Hong Kong. And since he is based in Hong Kong, his work is predominantly in the East Asia region. Then, without further ado, I hand over to Richard Oakley. Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Hans, for that. And thank you for the audience joining in on this. It's not quite nice to see it's a topic that clearly interests people. We have quite a lot of participants here. Right, so the purpose of the talk is quite straightforward. It's to talk through my experience and my views of the changing job of a casualty investigator solicitor. This is of the views I've gained over joining Ince in 2008 has been mentioned. So I'm just going to go to the slide presentation now. Just 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk about casualty investigation as it was when I first joined Ince, the developments that I've witnessed over my time here, and how I see casualty investigation being for now and in the future. Then I'm going to briefly talk about the changes that have occurred in the Admiralty Court in London, specifically London, so I think they're keeping up to speed with developments. And then hopefully, if time permits, a short chat about how I see the future. So, casualty investigation the old way. On the picture here, you can see the sort of evidence that me as a new casualty investigation would have to look at when I went out to ships. As I mentioned, joining Ince in 2008, newly qualified solicitor. There were about 6 mariners in our office then doing this job, and probably another 3 or 4 casualty investigators who had actually never been to sea, weren't even legally qualified, but nevertheless spent really their working lives doing this job. So it was very seen as a job, investigating casualties, that you learn through experience. It wasn't necessarily much of a legal job in that you weren't sweating over what the law was about, but you certainly had to understand such things as the collision regulations, the Hague-Visby rules, and so on, so as to know what questions to ask when you investigated, and also what documents to look for. But this is the problem. Casualty investigation is about establishing the facts. And on that screen, you can see how the facts were recorded on paper, on a chart where positions were put on the chart but could be easily rubbed out and put somewhere else, in a deck logbook that maybe recorded courses and speeds every hour or maybe every 4 hours, but again could be doctored. You also see there a picture of a paper course recorder. Now, those who've been at sea for a while, that'd be a very familiar picture to you. It just basically records the ship's heading over time on a constantly rolling paper. Often the paper was fitted so that the clock time in it didn't correspond to ship's time. Often the pen nib would break. Often the clockwork mechanism would break. Also in the bottom left-hand corner, you now start to see the first automated recording of data, the engine data logger, which recorded the movement of the ship's telegraph, controlling the ship's speed automatically. That was probably the first bit of recording evidence, which was purely automatic and you could feel you could rely on. Okay, so the next slide here. So how I saw casualty investigation once I first started. Because when we were notified of a casualty, the owners, more often than not, all they knew about it was what the master told them on a satellite phone, or what they'd been told in a telex message or a fax message or through the agents. No one likes to admit mistakes, cock-ups. So what they were being told by the ship's crew often didn't match what was really happening. Therefore, attendance was on board the ship was essential to grill the crew, to gather the evidence, to figure out what had happened. This meant in the early days, all those chaps I mentioned who worked in the Ince casualty department were told best to have an overnight bag in the office 24/7, because when the call goes, you don't go home to pack your bag, you go straight to Heathrow, pick up your ticket, and you fly out to wherever we think the ship's going to be next. We're also told to have 2 passports. Apply to the passport office, get 2. So one could be getting sorted with a visa to go to a particular country and still allow you to travel. That was literally how the job was. There were many times I'd phone my wife and say, sorry, I'm not coming home tonight. I'm flying off to X and I don't know when I'll be back. That's what it was all about. We had to get out there to make sure we got the crew to tell their recollection of events while it was fresh in their memory. Also try and make sure that the crew weren't doctoring their recollections, sometimes quite innocently, because when you recall events of an accident, you want to recall the events in a way that reflects you in a good light. Sometimes, though, they would lie. Sometimes the records that we got there simply weren't sufficient enough to explain what had gone on in relation to the navigation of the ship, were inaccurate, sometimes even doctored. Now, the problem with all of this, we've come away from that exercise with all the documents, with draft statements of the crew, and say if it was a collision, for instance, maybe 6 months, a year later, we'd end up having a meeting with the opponent's solicitors for their ship, a WP meeting, where we'd explain to each other what our respective investigations had discovered in relation to the circumstances. And lo and behold, the opposition would have a completely different story to our own. And there the battle starts. Who's right? Whose evidence is the best? Whose evidence will be believed in court? All about evidencing the facts. Haven't really talked about the law. The law, everybody knew. It's the collision regulations. It was the Hague-Visby rules. That's in the books. But the facts had to be obtained from the ships. In my time, what's developed? Well, most of you being members of the Nautical Institute will know a fair bit about this. Of course, we had the development of GPS, satellite navigation. That was actually owned by the US government, but was made available for civilian use in the 1980s. Ability to tell your position in lat and long anywhere in the globe. Automatic identification systems came in the mid-2000s, and ECDIS came in, that's electronic chart data information systems, came in later in the 2000s. But at that stage, they weren't mandatory. That's both AIS and ECDIS. So those ship owners who weren't willing to spend that much money on such luxuries as AIS and ECDIS could get away with it. So it wasn't until some years later that it became mandatory, and we were seeing those sort of bits of kit all the time. Also, what developed was the integrated bridge systems, where all of this GPS, AIS, ECDIS, and radar information started to be merged into one centralized display, often on the ECDIS and the radar display. And then a real shift in the game as far as casualty investigation is concerned. In the mid-2000s, VDR, Voyage Data Recorders, became compulsorily fitted on ocean-going ships. But at that stage, the requirements of what the Voyage Data Recorder, effectively the black box on the ship, was rather limited and not comprehensive. But then later in 2012, the requirements of what VDR has to record was vastly improved, and I'll come back to that later. And of course, during all this time, every crew member has a phone in their back pocket with the ability to take film clips and photos. That's evidence too. So that came in as well. Okay, I think we're all familiar with this stuff, but it's worth just recapping what it's about. GPS, US owned, gives accurate position, operates on 24 satulites. It's three-dimensional. It gives your position in latitude and longitude based on the GS84 globe referencing system. And it also gives you your altitude above sea surface. In 2000, up until 2000, the position accuracy was deliberately degraded by the US. That was because they wanted to keep the most accurate position fixing system only available to the military, the US military. But then in 2000, that was done away with, whereby the accuracy for civilian use was bringing positions down to 5 meters. Then since 2018, the accuracy has been improved even more. GPS positions on the WGS85 system are now within an accuracy of 30 centimeters. Just think about that, 1 foot. No matter where you are on the globe, it can tell your position within 1 foot. Of course, your position on a latitude and longitude really has to be projected onto a chart to give any meaning to you. So we still have a concern, though, about the accuracy of the chart behind your lat and long system, and we'll mention that a little bit later. Okay, so let's now also talk about AIS. AIS kind of sneaked up on us while in the maritime industry, and then it wasn't really intended to be used as a collision avoidance aid. It was simply to enhance the safety of life at sea. It was a transmission of automated data from a ship to whoever could receive it on a VHF type frequency. And that data would contain information such as ship's name, port of destination, length, breadth, cargo carried, heading, speed, all that sort of stuff. And it's a cheap system to install. And I think it's actually improved the ability to navigate significantly, probably just as significantly as, say, radar has. So I would say it does contribute significantly to the prevention of collision. And I think it actually has some advantages over radar and even ARPA. But it hasn't had universal acceptance, and you can find reports where it's been criticized. Here I'm referring to the Ritten's Dubai case and NAIP report, and it just shows here how it can go wrong. the Vulcan Wizard was a barge being towed by a tug, which was struck by the Rickner's Dubai ship in the English Channel. The problem was the tug didn't have AIS, and neither did the barge. And what the officer of the watch, the Rickner's Dubai, was doing was just looking at his AIS display. So if there's no AIS data for this target, he's not going to see it. There's a risk of collision. Sorry, we're just having trouble with, okay, we're back there. Just 1 minute. Now what I want to try and do to make this a bit more jazzy is play you some of the AIS data that we can create here at our firm. So this AIS data is flying around all over the place, and you can purchase this data. No, not that one, the film clip. Just 1 second, guys, the Singapore Straits. Okay, sorry about that. Hopefully you can see this now. This is data that we can obtain on the open market. It's AIS data of ships in the Singapore Straits. Now I can get this data almost within 5–10 minutes and have this set up. So just think about how my job has changed now. I get advised of a casualty, where it's happened roughly and the time that it's happened. I can draw this down and have a look at what's going on, even before I've thought about going down to the airport and flying out to the ship. Now you have to ask yourself, knowing what I know, having watched this AIS data, do I even need to go down to the ship and interview the crew? So here we are, this is a collision case. The green ship at the bottom is a VLCC and laden, proceeding eastbound in the Singapore Straits. We're in a precautionary area right now of the traffic separation scheme. The sort of purple hatch lines signifies that, but going into the eastbound line soon. You notice green's come to port a little bit. Why did it do that? Not obvious. The best bet is there's maybe some fishing boats off its starboard bow. Red is a Panamax-built carrier coming up slowly to overtake. Purple is a little container ship also overtaking red. And now look what happened. Green comes to port. Why has it done that? Red comes to port to avoid green. Purple comes to port, but way too late, and green's come back to its course. Sorry. So, like I say, how has my job changed? I've got that before I've even had any information given to me by the ship. What's missing? Why did green come to port? My best guess, fishing boats in the way, trying to dodge something at the last minute. If I say represented red, I'd be telling them now, okay, I want to speak to the master on the bridge on using the satellite phone to work out, get some more information. With that information, just by phoning, I'm almost getting there to the conclusion of what might have gone wrong. So, hugely helpful AIS where the coverage is good. I'm going to show you another one now. Another clip. Yeah, that one. This shows how AIS is also useful, not so much in a collision context, but in a salvage context. For you mariners there, maybe you can tell me which port this is when towards the end of the film. What happened to the ship there? It would have been under pilotage and it just swerves to port. Why would it do that? It manages to stop. There's 8 meters of tide above these soundings, so it didn't ground then. But what happened? And now look, it sort of swings round. Is it swinging to its anchor? I think it did. Did it have a blackout, which meant it lost its engine and its rudder? and that's why it just veered round, and then it lost its anchor, dropped its anchor at the last minute to stop it going aground. Did the pilot then just call in for that tug to come in and assist it? I probably think that tug's secured to the stern now, but the ship's staying in position. It must be at anchor to be able to do that. And there's a tide running, there's wind, but it's not shooting down river. The anchor must be down. Here comes the other tug to assist. So we've got two tugs assisting. But both of the tugs are aft. They're not trying to hold the bow. That bow is being held in position. The anchor must be down. It's not aground. So like I say, I haven't even spoken to the ship's crew. The tugs are claiming salvage for these services. Maybe the forward tug's secure now. It's hard to say. Are they heaving up the anchor now as I watch the bow turn a little bit to starboard as they get that anchor back up again? Have they fixed the engine and the rudder now and they can get underway? And look, it moves forward now without being towed. I think they've got the engine going and it's off again. And the two tugs, though, are staying to escort it on its way up this river. That would be sensible. It's just had a blackout. The pilot's going to say, no, I want the tugs to stay with us until we're sure everything's okay. Now, one tug's being dismissed, okay, but the other one's staying with it. It's not towing it, it's making its own way. Now look what happens. That tug that was dismissed suddenly shoots back at full speed. If you watch the speed of the ship, it starts slowing down, but it can stay on its course. Has it had an engine failure but can still steer? Is that what's happening now? Has the forward tug secured to tow it whilst the ship is still steering, but the engine is knocked out? I would say that ship's being towed now because of the position of the tug forward. As to the port, any guesses? It's the Queen's Channel there, might give it away. And there she goes. So she's still being towed by the forward tug and the other tug accompanying it. And then, lo and behold, there we go. It looks like everything's back in order because the two tugs have moved away from their position. They're just escorting it. The ship's in open seas now, away from shallows. And hey presto, away go the tugs. And there goes the ship. And then the tugs tootle all the way back to port. So what did I learn from that? There were two incidents of emergency assistance. But the first one, it looked like the ship was able to it had a rudder and steering failure, causing it to shear to port, but it was able to let its anchor go to hold it in position. Self-help, no salvage services given yet. Yes, the tugs came later and gave it the comfort of being there to help it should there be any problems, but it looked to me like the ship was able to save itself from a grounding, and really the tugs were just giving comfort. It then proceeds up the channel, and there seems to be a rudder failure, but not engine failure, and the tugs have to come back and tow it along. Although again, the ship would have been able to anchor in the channel with just its rudder and no engine, had the tugs not been there. So you can imagine getting a call from this ship owner saying, yeah, we've got these tugs demanding salvage services and a payment under Article 13 of the Salvage Convention. They say they saved us from going aground, all this sort of stuff. The reward must be high. I downloaded this data. Within minutes, I've got a good view, a phone call with the master to clear up some of the factual issues that I'm guessing at this point, but where I can actually firm up and confirm with some calls. It's the difference between paying a salvage award for something like that of maybe £300,000 to £150,000, and all by looking at AIS data, which we pull down from service providers without any contact to the ship. Okay, so go back to the slideshow. Right. Now I'm going to talk about ECDIS, electronic chart data information systems, electronic charts. But I'm going to read out to you some very wise words from the Admiralty in the UK, taken from the pilot book, 6th edition, 1929, and is as valid today as it was then. While the Admiralty charts can be relied upon to be correct for all information received, it should be clearly understood that the value of a chart depends on the character of the original survey and on the completeness of the reports of subsequent changes. How true are those words? It applies to paper charts and it applies to ECDIS. So I'm going to talk why I'm saying that. I'm going to talk about a case we've recently handled. This was a bulk carrier that had loaded coal down the southeast corner of Borneo. If you look at that map there, it would have left that bottom corner of Borneo, headed east, and then up the Mascara Straits up to China. Quite a regular route. But you'll see the Mascara Straits, one side of it's quite shallow, whereas the eastern side is far deeper. So it's got to get into the deep water. Now, this isn't actually the ECDIS display of that ship. This is again what we've been able to draw down from AIS data, put on top of an electronic chart. But this is what it really would have looked like. It picked a route through those shallows where you can see a whole line of shallows on the right-hand side. And it picked that route on sort of 3 legs. And at the end of that red line, you can see where it went aground. Funnily laden bulk carrier, about 10-meter draft, stuck there in the middle of nowhere. If you were on that ship, what you would have seen is the islands to the south, and they've zoomed in now to the grounding position. You see the blue marker saying grounding position, and that big blue circle there is on the electronic chart, a shallow area, too shallow for the ship. And also just below the dark blue dot of the grounding position, just below it and to the left. But can we use the cursor? No. This is the grounding position here. And you can see another sounding there, which should not have allowed the ship to go aground. So how on earth can that ship be aground there where the charted data says the water is deep enough? Well, what I think is the problem, sorry, there we go. What I think is the problem here is with ECDIS charts, you have the ability to zoom in on what is in fact a small scale chart, giving an impression of safety, when in fact, the level of sounding data and hydrographic information is incredibly low. Now, in the good old-fashioned days of charts, paper charts, there would be a segment on the chart which would tell you all the source data, the years that the areas were surveyed, sometimes often 50, 60, 70 years ago. And a mariner would think, well, you know what was the survey abilities in like 1920 and 1940? Not great. So I'm going to give a great deal of caution to the underwater data on this chart. Now that has been replaced by something called CartZog, where you go onto the electronic chart and there's a little information symbol, you click it and it will give you a CartZog data A1, A2, B, C, or D, like this. And what most mariners concentrate when they think of accuracy of the charted data and depth accuracy is the third column on the left, where, for instance, B, it's at depths of 10 meter, an accuracy of plus or minus 1.2 meters. That sounds really accurate to me. You know, I don't need to know my position in those shallows to an accuracy of 1.2 meters. But read the text in the next box. Full area search not achieved. uncharted features, hazardous to surface navigation are not expected, but may exist. May exist. So, let me just go back a slide. I believe, and I can't be quite sure, that it was a CART sub B for this data. So what I suspect, and I'm happy to hear other views, is what it's saying is that sounding of 27 meters is probably an accuracy of 1.2 meters, fine. But it's not saying that 200 meters away there isn't a sandbank. The fact that there is no data, sounding data, where the ship went aground actually means no one's ever surveyed that point. That's just that one point has been surveyed by depth echo sounder probably and confirmed as being 27 meters and marked on the chart. But no one's gone over this entire area and checked it all entirely as they would have done in, say, the English Channel or some other busier places. So if we go back one slide again, anyway. So what I'm driving at here is, should this ship have been picking its route through this area in the way that it did, when in fact there is a far safer route to the south of the island that you can see in the bottom right hand corner. And when we go and search the AIS data for ships of similar drafts over a 6-month period from this particular port, all leaving the port to go to the east, we can see them all take that safer route, or at least most of them. So this is the errant one. Why is this all important from a legal perspective? Well, it's this. If the passage plan is defective and that defect causes the grounding, and therefore the cargo interests on board that ship have to contribute to all of the expense to get the ship refloated and carrying on to the port, then if that passage plan is defective at the commencement of the voyage, i.e. at the low port, cause of grounding, the ship will be found unseaworthy. This is all in accordance with the Hague-Visby rules. And the test that they apply is that of a prudent master. So you've got to say to yourself, at the low port, if the prudent owner test, at the low port, if the owner of the ship was on that bridge, and has that owner taken all the proper steps to ensure the ship is seaworthy at beginning and before the commencement of that voyage? Well, I think if the owner had been on the bridge of that ship looking at that passage plan, he would have said, well, I don't think that's right. We should go around to the south. And I think he'd probably be right. And therefore, that grounding occurred because of the unseaworthiness of the ship. And therefore, cargo owners do not have to contribute to the cost of refloating the ship and getting the cargo to the final destination. So quite a lot of money starts turning on these points in regards to looking carefully at the passage plan now and making sure it is what a prudent owner would expect a passage plan to look like. I also want to talk about how passage plans have changed in my career. Actually, in my career at sea, passage plan actually was more often than not from pilot station to pilot station, drawn on the charts. I mostly worked though on liner container ships, but nevertheless, the course lines ended at the pilot boarding point, and we didn't know which pilot we would get on board. We certainly knew the ports well, but it just shows how times have changed, because then berth to berth passage plans became necessary. And then the paper passage plan, which is where we would record all the waypoints and so forth, which was in effect the passage plan. I think that paper document isn't really the passage plan anymore in respect of the analysis of seaworthiness or not, where the ship is fitted with ECDIS displays, because the way you can manipulate the chart data now with an ECDIS using corridors of safety and bringing in and out certain depth features and contours that we can see here, means, in fact, the passage plan is a far more looser thing than it was. It wasn't just a stack of paper listing waypoints. The passage plan now is this thing, the ECDIS and its displays, and you need to make sure it all looks right and it's proper, and the guys on your ships understand how to use it. Very complicated bit of kit. There are many types of designs around, so everyone needs to understand how to use it. Incredibly important. Okay, and now all of this technology has come into one place during my career. Electronic charts, radar with ARPA, AIS, and they're all getting integrated into integrated bridge systems now, giving a huge amount of information to the navigator. So if I were to go on board ship now, you can see it's going to be a far more technical job than it was in the past, which was just sitting down the witnesses with my notebook and the chart and the deck logbook in front of me and interrogating them. Now I'm asking them for the VDR data. Now I'm asking them to download the AIS display. I go on board ships now with 2 laptops, one operating on one particular Windows operating system and another on another, because sometimes the VDR equipment isn't compatible with operating systems. It's become a far more technical job than it used to be than just me with a notebook and pencil. Okay, Voyage data recorders. This was the revolution for me in casualty, and really I think meant that more often than not, with a casualty investigation, the starting point is there's no need to go on board unless you think there's a real good reason for doing so. Voyage data recorders are not a navigational aid. All they are is a means of recording navigational data, the ship's black box. And you can see here a list of all the sort of stuff we can typically get. Now, remember how the regulations changed in 2012. So that was a milestone. Before 2012, VDRs only had to record a maximum of 12 hours of data. And of course, ship owners and manufacturers being what they were, they designed VDRs to only have 12 hours of data, after which it gets overwritten. So in the early days with this equipment, there were still huge problems for us, because sometimes after an incident, the crew would forget to press the save button. So all of the 12 hours of data that recorded the incident would get overwritten by the time we got out there. Sometimes they were not pressing the button properly, or they press it 2 or 3 times. They simply didn't know how to use the equipment, unfamiliar with it. Another problem was the early VDRs would only typically record one of the 2 radar displays and maybe the AIS data as well. Ships, as we know, have 2 radars on board. What happens if they were navigating on the one radar which was not being recorded, whereas the other radar was on standby mode, and that was the picture being recorded by the VDR? We've lost the radar picture. So that was a common problem now. All fixed come 2012, all new ships then having improved VDR. And this is critical as well. From 2012, the VDRs had to record a minimum of 30 days of data. So in effect, there was no longer any need for the crew to intervene and press the save button. It wasn't necessary. So long as you were notified of the incident within 30 days of it happening, which, to be frank, any owner should be able to do that, you can be pretty sure if the ship's built after 2012 that the VDR data is there, whether the crew pressed the save button or not. So that got solved, that problem. And what's happening now, of course, I mean, again, when this was all kicking off and this stuff being introduced, the VDR technician would put it on a memory stick and post it by up to me wherever I was working. Now, of course, what's happening is the crew or the VDR technician are uploading it onto the ship's computer. It's being beamed across to owners, and owners are beaming it across to me at my desk here in Hong Kong So within 12 or 24 hours of an incident happening, I'm already sitting at my desk with the AIS data I've got from my service providers. And I've also got VDR that I can play on my computer with my headset on, listening to what's going on, seeing what's going on. All the inputs are there. Just for those who are not quite familiar with what VDR might look like, it's quite tough for me to play a live VDR to you. That's because it requires particular software and it's hard to install it onto this particular computer. I'm just going to use some stills for you here. So this is a typical VDR display. Top box. Here is the heading, a continuous feed from the gyro compass, constantly updated, so we know the heading accurately. The engine telegraph setting here, dead slow ahead, and the rate that it's turning, 33.6 revolutions per minute. Wind speed and direction there. GPS position and time, lat and long, the rudder position, the depth sounding. And now these buttons down here, we can pull up the radar display. So there we are. This is quite an old image, actually. This is a straightforward radar display here. Now that's being refreshed every 15 seconds on most VDRs. So I'm getting a live picture of what the radar display looks like for the officer of the watch. I can see the officer of the watch using the cursor and moving it around the screen. So I can even tell that the officer of the watch is keeping a lookout, at least a radar lookout, because he's operating it properly. Now, interestingly, I mentioned, I'm interested to know people's views about radar ARPA function and ECDIS function. This is an interesting point I find that when I do investigations now, almost exclusively, the officer of the watch is not using the ARPA function and is simply displaying AIS vectors over the targets, which is what's going on here. The AIS vectors from the yellow ships are the white dashed lines. Now, I accept that the AIS vector lengths are hard to interpret and understand, but I personally believe, because this is the vector direction for these ships on the AIS is taken from the gyro compass heading of that ship. In other words, the other ship's steering compass is sending a signal to its AIS transponder as to what its heading is. Right then, its compass heading is being beamed out, it's being received by my ship and interpreted and displayed there straight away. So as soon as the heading on the other ship changes, so will the vector of the other ship on the radar display change. Whereas I would say an ARPA vector, the vector will take longer to change because it never knows the ship's heading. What the ARPA function is doing is carrying out a calculation of the relative bearing and distance of the other ship and own ship's heading and speed, which are actually has to be inputted. So there's room for error there, and it triangulates the calculation. But it means that if the other ship changes heading, it's only until that change of heading is evidenced by the fact that the yellow blob has moved in a slightly different direction that the vector starts to change. So I suggest that actually when an officer of the watch is trying to determine the heading of another ship, the AIS vector direction is probably the most accurate. Let me put it this way. I see collision avoidance for officers of the watch as being a three-stage process. One, does a risk of collision with the other ship exist? How do I determine that? I take a series of compass bearings or radar bearings, and if it's steady, a risk exists. That's the bearing, easy, it fails safe. We all know that works. You can't cock it up. Right. If you've determined that a risk of collision exists, what's the next step? 2, you have to determine which of the steering and sailing rules of the collision regulations applies. Is it a crossing ship? Is it head-on ship? Is it an overtaking ship? To know that, you have to know the aspects of the other ship relative to you. To know the aspect of the other ship, you need to know its heading. Its heading, not its path over the ground, its heading, what its compass heading is at that precise time. Now you can gauge that by looking out the windows, as all good mariners can. But if you want real confirmation of it, the most accurate data of ship's heading is from the AIS, because it's so quick and instant, and it comes from the source. It comes from the other ship's compass bearing. So you've now determined which of the collision regulations apply. And so you, therefore, stage 3 is you need to take avoiding action in compliance with the rules. For that, the really useful information is CPA and TCPA, because it gives you some way of gauging just how far away the ship is and how quickly you have to act. And CPA and TCPA is best derived from the ARPA, which can calculate that quite quickly, but also so can the AIS function on most radars now. So that's how I see collision avoidance now. 3 steps. Does a risk of collision exist? Steady compass bearing. If yes, apply the collision regulations. I need to know the ship's heading relative to us. 3, take avoiding action. Most useful information there is to know the other ship's CPA and TCPA. So jumping back to the VDR displays, this is how the AIS data is recorded by the VDR when it gets downloaded onto the computer for me. And you can see in the grey box to the right, all of the sort of information that wouldn't, in my days at sea, wouldn't have. The name of the other ship, where it's going, what its heading is, what cargo it was carrying, what its draft was. All new information now instantly available to the officer of the watch and available to me as a casualty investigator, in which I would need to suck up. Next page. Of course, I've mentioned there are radar microphones now fitted in the bridge, so we can isolate out the microphones and listen to what the guys are saying to each other on the bridge, and also listen to what the VHFs are saying at the time. And now the cherry on the top, if you want, of the sort of missing bits of information that we can get. The VDR doesn't actually record what the guy can see out through the windows. Now I'm coming across ships fitted with CCTV cameras, and we'll have a look at one of those later. So I need to go and suck up all of that CCTV information as well. Also now every officer has a phone in his back pocket. And so I'm asking them, did you take any photos of what's going on? I need to suck up that information too. Okay, first I'm going to look at a cargo type situation where a handheld phone proves incredibly useful. So this is in relation to a ship that was going to load a cargo. This is the hold. There it is, ready to receive the cargo. It was going to load ball clay. Now, ball clay in the IMSBC code is a Group A cargo. It has a propensity to liquefy if it is wet enough. Now, I think we've probably all heard of liquefaction, so hopefully we're all au fait with that. So this is a big concern. Will it liquefy? Now, the rules have specific requirements that these sort of category A cargoes have to come accompanied with a test certificate, which says its moisture content, and a further certificate with its transportable moisture limit. And if the moisture content is below the limit, you can load it. If it's above, you can't. Now, this cargo complied from a documentary perspective. It's had a low enough moisture content to be carried. Next slide. There it is, all clay. Now, I suppose it looks a bit wet, but clay is always going to look wet, isn't it? Otherwise, it'd be hard and dusty. but it doesn't exactly look as if a whole load of water is going to come falling out of it. Plus, the master's got the certificates in his hand saying it's safe to carry. And in fact, in this case, there was also a surveyor carrying out what we call a can test on samples of the cargo, and he thought it was okay. Here it is going into the hold. Yes, okay, it looks wet if you like, but like I say, clay is going to be wet when carried in bulk like this. I would say it hardly looks like something that's going to turn into a lake of water. This ship sailed. 4 days into the voyage, it starts listing. The crew go down and they say to the master something's wrong with the cargo, it's moving around. They abandon ship. Thankfully, all the crew get off and are saved, but the ship sinks. Now here, if I'm representing the ship owner, I want to be able to say to the cargo owners, you loaded an unsafe cargo. They would point to the certificates that were given to the master at the load port and say, look, it complied, there's nothing wrong with it. Whatever your crew are telling you, they're making up a pack of lies. Your ship was probably got a leak in the ballast tank and fell over because of that, or you've done something wrong, but nothing to do with the cargo. Now, this brings us right up to date now with the COVID regulations. The crew were landed in East Asia, not in Hong Kong. I couldn't fly out and interview and find out what was going on. They couldn't speak English. So now the investigator has to try and do the investigation remotely using systems like Zoom and WeChat. Also, we've got to employ a translator. Also, there's going to be the local correspondents in that country who want to hear what's going on. Now, imagine the arranging of that. And in fact, when we interviewed this crew, the master and the chief officer who said they knew what had gone on, I think there were about 8 people on the call, and it was going through translations. I think there are three different languages in use. Sorry, we also had our cargo expert there who wanted to ask questions too. During that rather painful exercise of investigating remotely, and whilst the cargo expert was trying to explain what a liquefied cargo might look like, which is basically a solid cargo which moves around like a liquid, through the translator, we get a gem of information from the officer. Oh yeah, I videoed it on my phone. And as soon as he said that, basically me and the expert fell off our chairs and said, show us this now. And he was able to download it immediately onto the call that we were having and showed us. Let me go to the camera bit. And here it is. Yeah, that one. And this is under the tween deck. Now the cargo's flat. And it's moving. It's rolling, you can see. All cargo is moving. There's no water on the top. But it's acting like a liquid. I don't know about you, but if I was that officer, I would be so worried about that. Ship's already at about a 50-degree list. So, hey presto, suddenly through this guy having the forethought of using his phone to video it, we don't care about cargo interest arguments about the documentation of the cargo. The simple fact is that that film clip proved that the cargo had liquefied. It was dangerous. Okay, now I'm going to show you another film clip from the ship I mentioned, which was fitted with CCTV. Unfortunately, the picture's degraded a bit, but you can see what's going on. This camera is actually fitted on above the bridge, looking forward at night, and you can tell already it's a container ship. You can even see the waves either side of the containers, can't you? Now it's night, but the camera is sensitive enough to pick up lights. You want to click? Can you click to that halfway? Yeah, there. Now, we all know what a ship looks like crossing from port to starboard. No, just a bit further. You see here. So that's a ship seen on its starboard side. So it's going from port to starboard, a crossing vessel, should keep out of my way. Let's just keep watching this. I'm sorry it keeps flicking in and out like that. But it's on a bit of it's on a steady bearing. It should be taking action to avoid, although when we look at the radar and we plot it, it's very slowly closing. It looks like it's trying to get across. We nudge a little bit to port there to let it get across. There it is now. It's almost dead ahead, crossing from port to starboard, showing its green light. But watch it now carefully. It's turning to starboard. There was a green light. There's its red light. It's turned, even though it's come over to our starboard side, and starts to try and get back across our bow. And here she comes, flying straight in. Wallop, full speed, both ships. The force is so strong, the guys on the bridge, who we can see on the CCTV camera, fall over. The hole left in that ship's bow was so big, it actually went through the bow, through the collision bulkhead, and into hole number 1, which flooded. Thankfully, she was in ballast and didn't sink. If she'd had cargo on board, I'm sure she would have sunk straight away. Now, I've shown you that CCTV camera because I think this is going to be the next stage. I mentioned that the VDR captures almost everything. It doesn't capture what the guys were actually doing, where they were standing on the bridge. It doesn't capture what they could see out of the windows. It doesn't capture the sea state. It doesn't capture what the lights of other ships were showing. But you can see with CCTV camera fitted in the way that it was on that ship, all of those questions start being recorded as well. So you're almost at a point and asking, why are we interviewing the crew? What is left to be found out?
Richard, I'm sorry.
Yes.
This is Hans. I'm just to make you aware that we are very close to 4 o'clock now. So
absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. I've got just a few slides left.
I know.
I'll rattle along as quickly as I can because maybe there'll be some questions coming in at the end.
You have some questions, yes.
All right, okay. Casualty investigation the new way. Before, I was always going out to the ship. Now I pause and ask myself, do I need to? If it's a super serious case, yes, I'm going to go out there because you can miss stuff with just the electronic stuff. Sometimes you do need to sit in front of the people, be on board and find out what's going on. But now the first steps I take is to obtain the AIS and VDR data immediately, and then potentially to fill in the missing gaps, carry out remote interviews in the way I described I did with the sunken ship and the shifting cargo. Now, so that's all been a huge game changer, and now super quick. The Admiralty Court in London is, in my view, probably the best place for having these disputes resolved where they can't be agreed. It's got a super long history in deciding the cases. It's got a dedicated Admiralty judge who knows an awful lot about this stuff. But in relation to navigational incidents, he will also have sitting on the bench with him a nautical assessor, a mariner of many years' experience, normally from Trinity House. And that mariner will feed into the judge directly issues of navigation and seamanship to help the judge form a view on how his judgment should be. Therefore, eliminating the need for experts as far as navigation and rules of the road are concerned. He gets that advice from the nautical assessor. And what's also really useful now is they're updating the procedure of the Admiralty Court in London to take into account the electronic evidence. So in the bad old days, before electronic evidence, it would take forever to get to trial because we'd have huge arguments about what had happened. To try and determine courses and speeds, we were having speed and angle of blow surveys created. By looking at the damage of the ship, you can get a rough idea of its courses and speeds at the time of impact. Handwriting experts were being called in to look at logbooks and charts to see if things had been rubbed out or rewritten again by the wrong people. Witnesses were having to be called from overseas to be cross-examined in trial. The trial itself would take several days to get to a final decision of the Admiralty judge. Now, what we have is the Admiralty judge saying, well, look, if all the parties have this electronic evidence, what they must do, even before commencement of proceedings in trial, is exchange that data with each other. Show each other what you've got. It's the facts. If you share it, then you're likely to make an agreement between yourselves without even coming to the court to argue over it. If you can't, he's saying you've got to think of all of the reasons why you could be able to speed this up and make it quicker for me. Question whether you want to call witnesses, because to be frank, what's the point of cross-examining a witness if you can see and hear everything that he's done in the electronic evidence? Yeah, if it's already recorded there, then why have the witness come from overseas to cross-examine? What do you want to ask him? We can see what is done. So think about excluding expert evidence. Disclosure. What's the point of disclosing to each other irrelevant logs and documents about navigation when the VDR has captured all the navigational maneuvers of the ship? Why do you need the deck logbook put in front of the judge when you can watch the VDR and see what the ship was doing second by second? Next page. And in fact, now the Admiralty Court is suggesting that if the electronic evidence is so clear, there is the potential for dispensing with a trial altogether and simply having written submissions put together and a bundle of evidence before the Admiralty judge to come to a conclusion. Okay, in the future, is there any need for solicitor mariners anymore? Well, there isn't a need for solicitor mariners to do the job in the old way. But I hope what I've shown here in this presentation, there is a need for mariners in law firms to be able to interpret, understand, and gather the electronic evidence. That's where we come in useful. Autonomous ships, is that the future? Well, will there be any need to do this? Are autonomous ships ever going to collide into each other? Well, I think looking at ships maneuvering around the world completely, from oceans to oceans, I think you're always going to need someone on the bridge keeping an eye out on what's going on, because anything can happen, anything that can come across. So autonomous ships for me now don't particularly worry me. I've got another 15 years in the business before I retire. I don't think I'm going to see autonomous ships all over the place within 15 years. So that's something for the next generation to worry about. That then brings my presentation to an end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was very interesting. Let's see if I can put my video back on. Thank you, Richard. We have a few questions. And the first one from Alan Lloyd. When tugs are employed to assist a vessel down a river to sea, can they claim salvage if something goes wrong, or are they restricted by the existing towage contract? A little bit outside the topic, but still an interesting question.
Yeah, sure. And it's a good question. That video clip you saw at the port was Liverpool, by the way, and the cargo ship had left its berth, and the two tugs that were assisting it to leave the berth had been dismissed. And then about 10, 15 minutes later, the blackout occurs. Now, those tugs would have been engaged in what is called the UK standard towage terms. And in fact, tugs are engaged typically on those terms in almost every country, even outside the UK. And what those terms state is, in particular, that the tugs will be paid for the services that they've been asked to provide, which is towing a working ship to and from the berth. But should anything out of the ordinary occur beyond those services, the tugs have the right to claim salvage. So from a contractual position, the owner has agreed with the tug owners that yes, the services outside of normal towage operations, they can claim salvage. So the answer is yes, they could in that instance, even though they were contracted to that ship to provide towage services all along.
All right. For Alan's sake, you're not going to charge him for that. Then Kaushik asks or says, I would like to know acceptance and validity of remote investigations in these COVID times.
Sorry, say that again, Hans.
Kaushik would like to know the acceptance and validity of remote investigation. I think
Yes.
he will mean the acceptance from crew, the owners,
Right. Yeah.
ship manager. Probably that is what he is asking.
Well, from the crew perspective, whether it's a remote interview or a face-to-face interview, they're always very cooperative in 99% of the time, even when they know they're in the wrong. The reality is, even when a mariner's in the wrong, he wants to get it off his chest. He wants to get it all done with. And when they get to be interviewed by me, I tell him, this is your chance now. Tell me the truth, because to be frank, you just want to get shot of this. You tell me the truth. You can forget about all of this then and just sleep well tonight. They especially tell me the truth when I've also say to them, by the way, I've listened to the VDR and I've watched the VDR and I've seen the AIS replay. So I already know a great deal of what's gone on. So if you start lying to me, I'm going to know. So let's just get to the truth straight away. Acceptance of remote interviews, as far as the court is concerned, well, the final product from the remote interview is a witness statement. So it doesn't really matter how that witness statement is generated, whether it's face-to-face or remotely. It's still a witness statement. It gets signed by the witness at the end as being a truthful recollection of events. So no problems there.
All right, thank you so much. Then Alan again says, you place considerable weight on AIS data, as do the courts in many cases, but AIS was intended to be an identification system. Are we over-relying on AIS data? Also, if two ships collide and one was relying on ARPA, while the other one was relying on AIS data, who would be the most heavily criticized?
To answer that last question first, both ships in that situation would be criticized, because as we all know, a navigator should use all the appropriate means available to him to assess the risk of collision, all available means. So he needs to look at his radar, his ARPA, his AIS, he needs to look out of the windows, he needs to look at it all and assess it all and put the big picture together. So there's not one is better than the other, or it doesn't work that way. If you're just relying on one system, you will be criticized. You need to use them all. AIS is the first part of the question. It's quite right. It was just supposed to be an identifier system, but it is so useful for the reasons that I've described that it does help. It helps people better assess the risk of collision and how to apply the collision regulations. It helps people like me to assess the facts and determine liability. So it's all positive from AIS. It's something that we have to embrace and accept. Gone are the days of thinking that ARPA and radar are the bee's knees and the only thing. There's other stuff out there, it all needs to be used.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very good alternative to VHF identification of
Indeed, yes.
ship on collision course. Gaurav is saying, hi Richard, it was a very informative presentation, thanks. A quick question on your feed to acquire AIS data. Do you recommend that the shore team procures this that the short team procures this from external sources even before we have all the details from the vessel as we normally do?
For me as an investigator and as a solicitor, I want the information as quickly and as rapidly as possible. So I've got no issue in getting AIS data because that's all in my control. I can just go out and get it from the service provider. In fact, we have a subscription service where our guy in London has instant access to it. If, say, I was a ship manager and there was a casualty, or something I wanted to investigate. Now, am I doing the wrong thing by getting the AIS data first before I've had a chance to speak to the crew or got the VDR data from the ship? I don't think you are. I don't think there are any rules here. You want, as a ship manager, to know what's gone on, and you want to know as soon as possible, just like me. So I can't see any harm in getting the AIS data. Remember its limitations, though. It's only going to show those boats and ships out there with AIS transponders. Yeah? The chart data that it's projected on may not be accurate. Yeah, so there may be other ships there that aren't there. AIS signals is intermittent now and again. So we have to remember that it's not the full picture. From one hit to the next, the AIS system interpolates. And that might not be a true representation of the 6 course and speed between the two. So no, I have no problem in anyone getting the data, but just remember its limitations.
Yeah, I agree. I have one more question for you, and after that we will close. Actually, I have many questions, but I will restrict to one. Going back to the ECDIS, how often do you see that incorrect feeding of speed and course to the ECDIS system causes incidents, collisions, groundings?
I haven't. It's probably the one area of knowledge and the electronic stuff that I'm maybe a little bit lacking is ECDIS. I've never sailed with it. So in fact, my firm's setting up a training exercise for us investigators with an ECDIS shore-based station to get us all used to what it can do. So I'm not sure if I'm really qualified to answer that question. What I think I am seeing, though, with ECDIS is maybe ship's crew not being as fully aware as to its abilities and how it can sometimes filter out information unknowing to them. There are many different systems around, and there are so many options and so many different versions that I have a great deal of sympathy for mariners now joining ships and being confronted with these machines, when in fact the paper chart was so easily understood. It's always there and be easily referred to. So I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure about the answer on the course and speeds. I presume most ECDIS for own ship's course and speed will have an input from the GPS or the ship's log. I'm not sure.
All right, thank you. No, the reason I was asking, I have seen it myself a few times that the crew, the deck officers on the bridge, they thought they were relying on correct speed and course input to ECDIS and radar to calculate the closest point of approach and so on, and they were not, and that was a direct cause for a collision.
And you probably agree, though, the similar problem can occur with radar and ARPA, where the ship's speed has to be inputted into the ARPA to create a true vector for the other ship. And if that speed input is incorrect, you know, rubbish in, rubbish out, as we used to say at college, although not the use the word rubbish.
I agree.
You know, so there are problems also with ARPA on that front. If the own speed and course is not correctly inputted, you get bad data out as well. Yeah,
no, I agree. So let's close with that, Richard. Thank you for an excellent presentation, and we have shared the plaque we usually are giving to our presentators. I will give that to you as soon as we meet in person. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to everybody that participated, and a special thank also to Patty Long with Storm Geo here in Hong Kong and her marketing team. They have been very, very helpful for us to set up this presentation, which we overrun by only 14 minutes, which I think is fantastic, considering this was the first webinar we have arranged here from Hong Kong. Thank you to everybody. Thank you, Richard, again. Take care. All be safe.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.